She arrived with 11 cents, a bruised face, and fingerprints around her throat, a woman the world had already thrown away. He was a rancher one bad winter from losing everything, raising 3 broken children alone. Neither of them was looking for a miracle. But sometimes the most extraordinary things happen when 2 desperate souls collide in the middle of a blizzard and refuse to let go. Welcome to our channel, where every story lives in the dust and the wind of the Wild West. We tell tales of cowboys and courage, of love born on the frontier, of mothers abjayas who chose their children with their whole hearts, and of strangers vipshards who became family simply by showing up when it mattered most. This story reminds us that the bravest thing a person can do isn't picking up a gun. It's trusting again after everything has tried to break you. If this story moved something in you, drop the name of your town in the comments. We'd love to know how far this tale has traveled. And if you believe everyone deserves a place to belong, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Like, subscribe, and ride along with us. The next story is already waiting.
The stage was running 3 hours late. That fact alone should have clued Jesse Holbrook in that something was badly wrong. Nothing ever ran late in Silver Creek, Montana, not unless the weather turned foul or someone had met their maker on the trail. He stood there on the porch of Perkins' General Store, collar pulled high against the biting wind, and kept his eyes on the northern road, where that coach should have been an hour before the sun began to dip. "Still waitin', I see," Dorothy Perkins said, leaning out from her doorway with her arms crossed. "Jesse, that coach is not coming. The snow is piled too high past Dutchman's Ridge. You best come inside before you turn into an icicle." "It will be here," Jesse replied. "Hayes never misses his Saturday trip. Hayes is 62 years old, and he is driving straight into a blizzard. Even a stubborn man has his limits." Jesse offered no reply. He just tugged his hat down a little lower and kept his gaze fixed on that empty road. His boots were soaked clear through. His fingers felt like they were about to break inside his gloves. But he had promised Billy he would be there to wait. And Jesse Holbrook was not a man who broke his word to folks he did business with. That was true even when those folks were a mail-order bride service way out in St. Louis, who had sent him a letter stating his intended would be on the December 14th coach. He had never wanted to send away for a wife. The whole idea felt wrong to him, kind of like trying to walk around in another fella's boots. But his daughter Lucy had not smiled in 6 months. Ellie had not said more than a few words since Hannah passed on. And Caleb, just 8 years old and trying his best to be the man of the house, had come to him last summer with a look in his eyes that was far too old for his face and said, "Pa, I reckon we need some help." That had just about shattered something inside Jesse. It was not the words themselves, but the cautious way his boy had said them, like he had practiced them over and over, worried that his pa might get mad. So Jesse had written the agency. Well, to be honest, he had Dorothy Perkins write for him, since his own handwriting looked like a chicken had stomped through an inkwell, and his spelling was even worse. Dorothy had put together a fine letter that described a widowed rancher, 38 years of age, with 3 children and 500 acres, who was looking for a woman of good character for marriage and to raise a family. The responses had come pouring in. Jesse had Dorothy read every last one of them to him. Most of the women sounded too chipper, too anxious, like they were selling something. But a single letter was different from all the rest. It was from a woman in Philadelphia named Margaret Calloway. Her script was tidy and small, and she chose her words with care. "I will not make myself out to be something I am not," she wrote. "I am 29 years old. I have no money and no family left that would have me. I know my way around a needle and thread, how to manage ledgers and how to look after the sick. I have lived through things I would rather not put down in a letter. What I am searching for is not a rescue. I am looking for a place where I can be of use, and maybe, with time, feel safe. If that is a thing you can provide, I would be deeply grateful for the opportunity." Jesse had Dorothy read that letter to him twice. After the second time, he just said, "Her. Right back to that one." that had all happened 2 months ago. Letters had traveled back and forth, each one getting a little longer, a little more truthful. Margaret, who mentioned folks called her Maggie, told him about her father's tailor shop and how she had learned to keep his books. Jesse, with Dorothy as his scribe, told her about his ranch, about losing Hannah, and about the kids who needed more than he could offer them by himself. He did not tell her about Wade Prescott. He did not tell her about the trouble that was on its way. Some things you just do not put in a letter. And now he stood waiting in the freezing cold for a woman he had never laid eyes on, wondering if he had done a truly selfish thing by inviting her into this life. Jesse? Dorothy's voice cut through his thoughts, sharper this time. There is something coming up the road. He saw it then. It was not the stagecoach, but a figure pushing through the snow. It was moving at the wrong pace, at the wrong height, way too low to the ground. Jesse stepped off the wooden sidewalk, his eyes narrowed against the blinding white. It was a person, walking, then stumbling, falling down, only to get back up and fall once more. Jesse was running before he even knew what he was doing. His boots crashed through the hard crust of snow with each and every step. Behind him, he could hear Dorothy yelling for Doc Shaw. He did not slow his pace. The figure collapsed about 50 yards from the edge of town. When Jesse finally got to her, she was lying face down in the drift. She had one hand stretched out as if she had been trying to reach for something. He fell to his knees beside her and gently rolled her over. She was a small woman, maybe 5'4", and was wearing a black dress that gave about as much warmth in a Montana winter as a single piece of newspaper. She had no coat and no gloves. Her boots were made for city streets, with thin soles that were split wide open at the seams. Her dark red hair had come undone and was frozen in stiff, icy strands against her cheeks. But it was her face that made Jesse's heart stop. Her bottom lip was busted open and swollen. A deep bruise marred her left cheek, a dark purple that was just starting to fade to yellow around the edges. It was not fresh, but it was not old either. And wrapped around her throat, just above her collar, were marks that looked just like fingerprints. Somebody had put their hands on this woman. Somebody had hit her in the face. And after all that, she had chosen to walk through a blizzard instead of staying wherever that somebody was. Ma'am. Jesse shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it tight around her. Ma'am, can you hear me? Her eyes fluttered open. They were green, like glass from a riverbed, and they were filled with a fear so powerful it made Jesse's own chest ache. Please, she whispered. Please do not make me go back. Nobody is making you go anywhere. What is your name? She tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering so hard she could not form the words. Jesse did not press her. He lifted her into his arms, and she weighed next to nothing, like a small bird, like something a strong gust of wind could just snatch away. He carried her toward the general store, where Dorothy was already holding the door open with a fire roaring inside. Sweet mercy, Dorothy whispered when she laid eyes on the woman's face. Set her down by the stove. I will go get some blankets. Jesse placed her gently in the chair nearest the flames. Her entire body was shaking with violent shivers that made her teeth click together and her hands dance in her lap. Dorothy piled blankets on her and carefully pressed a mug of hot coffee into her hands. Drink this, Dorothy commanded. Just little sips. You are nearly frozen solid. The woman did as she was told, wincing when the hot coffee touched her split lip. Her gaze darted all around the store like she was a trapped animal, taking note of every exit, sizing up any threat. Jesse had seen that look before, in horses that had been mistreated, in dogs that would flinch if you so much as raised a hand. My name is Jesse Holbrook, he said, his voice quiet and steady. This here is Dorothy Perkins. You are in Silver Creek, Montana. You are safe now. At the sound of the name Holbrook, something in her eyes changed. First came recognition, and then something much worse. Shame. Margaret Calloway, she said. Her voice was just a faint whisper, all raspy, as if she had been screaming for hours. I am the woman you sent for. Jesse felt like the whole floor had dropped out from under him. This was his mail-order bride. This broken, bruised, and half-frozen woman was the person he had asked to come into his home, to be a part of his children's lives. "What in God's name happened to you?" he asked. "The stagecoach," she began, but then she paused. She drew in a breath that seemed to cause her pain. The stagecoach broke an axle up on Dutchman's Ridge. The driver, a Mr. Hayes, he went to find help. But there was another passenger, a man. He said he knew my name from the agency list. He said he had paid for me first and that I was his property. Dorothy's face turned as white as a sheet. Who was he? He never told me his name. A big fellow with a red beard. He tried to pull me from the coach. When I fought back, She touched her throat. I managed to get away and ran into the woods. I walked all through the night. "You walked 12 miles in a blizzard," Jessie stated. It was not a question. I did not know how far it was. I only knew that I could not stop walking. Just then, Doc William Shaw came bustling in, breathing hard and with his medical bag slapping against his leg. He was a tall, skinny man with kind eyes and hands that shook a little bit, right up until the moment he started his work. Then they became as steady as a rock. "Let's have a look," he said, all business. He checked her face, her throat, and her hands. "Frostbite on 3 fingers, but it is minor. It should heal just fine. This bruise on your face is 4, maybe 5 days old. Somebody hit you more than one time. And these marks on your throat," he said, looking straight at Jessie. "Someone tried to strangle her." "I know," Jessie said in a low voice. "There is more," Doc Shaw said, his voice dropping even lower. "She is badly underfed. She has not been eating right for weeks, maybe even longer. And these injuries to her face, they did not all happen at once. Some are older, just layers of bruises. This woman has been beaten over and over for a very long time." Tears welled up in Maggie's eyes, but she refused to let them spill over. "My husband," she said. "My late husband. He passed away 2 months ago. His brother took over the house. He was worse." The room fell completely silent. "You were running from your brother-in-law," Jessie spoke. "I wrote back about your advertisement the very next day after we buried my husband. Your letters were the only thing that saw me through everything that followed. The night the money for my passage arrived, I slipped out with nothing more than my sewing kit and the clothes on my back." She glanced down at her tattered dress. "I had 15 cents to my name when I got on that train in Philadelphia. Now I have 11. A noise rumbled deep in Dorothy's throat, a mix of pure anger and sorrow. "You poor thing." "I am not a child," Maggie said, and her voice had a core of steel, even though she was trembling. "And I am not poor. I am alive. I can work. I can pull my own weight. All I need is a chance." Jessie just looked at this woman, this stranger he had brought into his world with carefully written letters and a hope that felt impossible. He had pictured someone sturdy, practical, maybe a little plain, but certainly not broken. He had not prepared for the bruises, the fear, and a type of courage that made his own troubles seem mighty small. "Miss Calloway," he began, "I have to be straight with you." Her face grew tense. She was preparing to be turned away. He saw it in the way she pulled her shoulders in, the way she held that coffee cup like it was the last solid object on earth. "I sent for you because my children need a mother. That part is still true. But I will not be marrying you tomorrow or next week or on some schedule cooked up by an agency in St. Louis. You have been through a terrible ordeal, and you need time to mend. So this is what I am offering, and you can take it or you can leave it." He paused, picking his words with care. "I have a spare room out at the ranch. It is not large, but it is warm, and the door has a lock. You can stay there, help out with the children, and do whatever work you find fitting. I will pay you $2 a week on top of your room and board. There are no other strings attached, no expectations. If you decide in a month or 2 that you want to stay and we get along, we can discuss marriage then. And if you decide this is not the life for you, I will pay your way to wherever you want to go. I will not ask a single question." Maggie just stared at him. "Why would you do that for me? You do not even know me. I know what I am looking at." I see a woman who walked 12 miles in a blizzard just so a man would not put his hands on her again. That says more about your character than any letter ever could." "He is right," Dorothy said with conviction. "And if you would rather stay here in town, I have a room upstairs and could surely use an extra hand in the store. Either way, you have a place here. Nobody in Silver Creek would ever turn away a woman who needs help." "Not nobody," Doc Shaw mumbled. And Jesse knew he was thinking of Wade Prescott, who would turn away anyone who could not pay their bill. Maggie looked from one to the other of them, these strangers showing her a kindness she clearly never saw coming. Her hands were steady now. Jesse could not tell if it was from the warmth of the fire or the warmth of their words. "Your children," she said, looking right at Jesse. "Tell me about them." A knot in Jesse's chest seemed to loosen. She was not about to run. She was asking the important questions. "Lucy is 11. She has been trying to play mother ever since Hannah passed, and the weight of it is running her ragged. She will be cautious with you, might even act hostile. Do not take it to heart. She is just terrified of losing somebody else." "And the others?" "Caleb is 8. He is a good boy. Tries a little too hard to please everybody. He will probably adore you within the hour if you let him. And Ellie?" Jesse's voice caught in his throat. "Ellie is 6. She quit talking right after her mother died. Not completely. She will whisper to Lucy now and then, or to the barn cat. But she has not said a full sentence to me in 4 years. Maggie's eyes went soft. 4 years. The doc says there is nothing physically wrong with her. Says it is just grief. He says she will talk when she is ready. But it has been 4 years, and I'm starting to wonder if ready is a time that will ever get here." "I would like to meet them," Maggie said softly, "if that is all. Write with you tomorrow. It is too late for tonight, and you need your rest. Dorothy, can she stay with you tonight?" "I already have the room warming up." Dorothy said, "You go on home, Jesse. Check on your children. She will be right here in the morning." Jesse settled his hat on his head and started to leave, but then he stopped. "Miss Calloway, one last thing." "Yes?" "That fellow on the stagecoach, the one with the red beard. Did he mention where he was going?" "Silver Creek. He said he had some business to attend to here." Jesse and Dorothy shared a look. "I will go talk to Sheriff Pruitt," Jesse said. "You be sure to lock your door tonight." He stepped out into the freezing air, and the wind met him like a solid wall. The snow was coming down harder now, thick and without mercy, turning the whole world into a swirl of white. Jesse turned his collar up and walked toward his wagon, where his horse stood, miserable but patient in the storm. He thought about Maggie Calloway, about the bruises on her face and the marks on her throat, and about the way she had said, "I am alive." She said it like it was a victory, which he figured it was. He thought about Hannah, who had been so strong and full of laughter and life, and then, all of a sudden, she was not. She had died in that back bedroom while a blizzard raged outside and Jesse rode like a madman for a doctor who showed up too late. He thought about his children. Lucy, trying so desperately to keep everything from falling apart. Caleb, acting like he was brave. And Ellie, trapped in her own silence like a little bird in a cage. And he thought about what Dorothy would say if she ever learned the real reason he sent away for a mail-order bride. It was not just about being lonely, and it was not just for the children's sake. It was because Wade Prescott had made it plain that a man without a wife was a man with no real standing in this town, and a man with no standing was a man whose land could be snatched right out from under him. The law in Montana Territory said a married man's homestead was safe from his creditors. An unmarried man's was not, and Wade Prescott held the note on half the spreads in Silver Creek, including Jesse's own. It was paper that claimed Jesse owed money he had already paid back. It was paper that was almost certainly a forgery, but it looked real enough to trick a judge. Jesse needed a wife to keep his land, and now the woman who was supposed to be his wife had shown up, beaten and bruised, running from one dangerous man straight into a town run by another. He climbed up onto the wagon and gave the reins a snap. The horse dug in against the harness, and they started down the road toward home. Behind him, a lamp burned in the window above Perkins's general store. And Jesse Holbrook drove straight into the storm, carrying the heavy truth of everything he had not told Maggie Calloway, and wondering just how long he could hide it from her before it all came crashing down on the both of them. When he got to the ranch, he found Lucy waiting for him right by the door. Her arms were crossed and her face was set in that special kind of fury a girl of 11 gets when she has been left in charge for too long. "You're late," she said flatly. Ellie refused to eat her supper. Caleb dropped a plate, and one of the barn cats had her kittens in your saddle. "I am sorry, Lucy girl. Did you at least get the flour?" Jesse had a sinking feeling as he realized he had left town without a single thing he went there for. "The store was already closed by the time I was done with my business." What kind of business takes all day long in town? Lucy's eyes narrowed. "Pa, did the stagecoach get in?" Jesse hung his coat on the peg and sat down to wrestle off his wet boots. Lucy stood right over him, just waiting. She had Hannah's face, the same sharp line of her jaw, and those steady eyes that never missed a thing. "It did," he said, "and we can talk all about it in the morning, Pa." "In the morning, Lucy." She held his gaze for a long second, reading his face just like she read the weather, like she read everything, always searching for the storm hiding behind the calm. Then she turned on her heel and walked back toward the kitchen without saying another word. Jesse found Caleb fast asleep on the rug in front of the fire, a book lying open on his chest. The boy had been trying to teach himself to read using an old almanac, sounding out the words by the firelight every single night. Jesse carefully lifted him up and carried him to his bed. In the girls' room, Ellie was lying. Ellie was curled on her side, her arm wrapped tight around the rag doll Hannah had sewn for her before she passed on. Even asleep, the little girl's face was all bunched up with a kind of worry, like she was listening for a sound that wasn't ever going to come. Jesse stood there in the doorway, just looking at his 3 kids sleeping in that cold house on that dark night. And in that moment, he made a choice. Tomorrow, he was going to bring Maggie Calloway to this ranch. He would give her the spare room, the work, and the wages he had promised her. He would let his children meet her and just see what unfolded. And he decided he would not tell her about Wade Prescott. Not right away. Not until she had a chance to get her feet under her, to heal up some, and to decide for herself if this life was something she truly wanted. It was selfish, and he knew it. But Jesse Holbrook learned a long, long time ago that sometimes just surviving took a certain kind of selfishness. The kind that made you bring a stranger into your home because you needed her, even knowing the trouble that was waiting right outside your door. The wind howled against the windows, something fierce. The fire crackled and settled into embers. And somewhere out in the middle of that storm, the world kept turning, not caring a bit about the small, desperate hopes of the people just trying to make it through. Jesse was up and moving before the sun. He fed the horses, broke the sheet of ice in the water trough, and went to check on the cattle in the nearby pasture. 14 head had wandered south during the night, leaning hard against the fence line like they could sense something bad was on its way. He pushed them back, working by himself in the gray morning light while his breath plumed in the air like smoke. By the time he made it back to the house, Lucy had breakfast ready on the table. There were eggs and salt pork and coffee that was mostly just hot water because they were getting low on the beans. Caleb was sitting in his chair, kicking his legs and talking a mile a minute. Pa, the barn cat, had 5 kittens. 5 of them. Can I keep just one? Billy Dawson from church said his pa drowns kittens. But that is just wrong, isn't it, Pa? You would not drown any kittens. Nobody is drowning anything, Jesse said. He poured his coffee and sat himself down. Lucy set a plate in front of him without saying a word. Ellie was in her chair, eating with her eyes pointed down at her plate, her little rag doll propped up right beside her like a guest for breakfast. I need to ride into town this morning, Jesse said. You were in town just yesterday, Lucy said, and you forgot the flour. I know I did. I will get it today. What is in town that is so important? Jesse put his fork down. He had planned to ease into the subject, to find just the right words, but Lucy's eyes were already full of suspicion, and he knew that beating around the bush with his oldest daughter only ever made things worse. There is a woman in town. Her name is Margaret Calloway. She has come a long way to help us out here on the ranch. I am bringing her home with me today. The kitchen got real quiet. Even Caleb stopped, kicking his legs. "Help us how?" Lucy asked. Her voice was as flat and cold as a frozen pond. "With the house and the cooking. Your schooling. All the things I'm not doing a good enough job with on my own." "We are doing just fine," Lucy said. "We are. I do the cooking. I do the cleaning. I look after Ellie and Caleb. We do not need some stranger coming into our house and telling us what to do." "You are 11 years old," Jesse said, his voice gentle. "You should not have to carry all of that. You should be reading your books and playing with your friends and just being a kid. I am not a child. Yes, you are. And I'm sorry that I let you forget that." Lucy's jaw went tight. She looked so much like Hannah in that moment that it felt like Jesse's heart cracked right down the middle. "Is she your mail-order bride?" Lucy asked. "The one you were writing the letters to?" Jesse had not known that Lucy knew about those letters, but he should have. Lucy knew every single thing that happened in this house. She was supposed to be. But things have changed. She has been through some very hard times. And right now all she needs is a safe place to land and some honest work. I have offered her the spare room and fair wages. That is all it is for now. "For now," Lucy repeated. "And what if I say I do not want her here?" Jesse reached his hand across the table and took his daughter's. "Then I would ask you to give her a chance anyway. Not for my sake, but for Ellie, for Caleb, and for you, even if you cannot see the reason for it yet." Lucy pulled her hand back and stood up from the table. "Fine, bring her here. But she is not my mother." She walked right out of the kitchen, and a second later, Jesse heard the hard slam of her bedroom door. Caleb looked at his father, his eyes wide. "Is the lady nice, Pa?" "I think she is." "Does she know how to make biscuits?" "Lucy's biscuits are as hard as rocks. But do not tell her I said that." For a second, despite it all, Jesse nearly smiled. "I do not know about her biscuits. We will have to find out." He glanced over at Ellie. The little girl had not moved an inch, had not even looked up. But her hand had found her rag doll and was squeezing it tight. Jesse wanted to say something to make her feel better, but he had learned a long time ago that words just seemed to bounce off Ellie like pebbles off a river. She lived inside a quiet that he could not find his way into, and it was the thing that hurt him more than anything else in this world. "I will be back in a couple of hours," he said. "Lucy is in charge." The ride to town took a lot longer than it should have. A fresh snow had fallen during the night, and the road was hidden under a foot of pure white. Jesse's horse picked its way forward with care, its ears pinned back against the cold. The sky was the color of dirty wool, hanging low and heavy like it was promising more bad weather. At Perkins' General Store, Dorothy was waiting for him with a cup of coffee and a look on her face that said she had some things on her mind. She barely slept a wink, Dorothy told him. "I heard her pacing the floor upstairs half the night, and she was up before I was this morning, which is really saying something. I found her in the store trying to reorganize my whole ribbon display. She told me she just could not sit still, and how is she? She is scared. But she is trying her best not to let it show. She asked me 3 separate times if you were really going to come back for her." Dorothy paused for a moment. "Jessie, that girl has been hurt in ways she has not even begun to tell us about. You be gentle with her. That is my plan. And you be honest with her. Do not you dare drag her into this whole mess with Wade Prescott without telling her exactly what she is getting into. I will tell her when the moment is right. The moment is right now. Dorothy, do not you start with me. Do not you Dorothy me, Jessie Holbrook. That woman has a right to know the truth, and she is going to get it. But for today she deserves a warm room and a hot meal that does not feel like a handout. Just let me give her that much first." Dorothy let out a huff, but did not argue anymore. She called up the stairs, and Maggie came down. For a second, Jessie hardly knew her. Dorothy had loaned her a decent wool dress, a dark blue one, and a heavy shawl. Her hair was all washed and pinned up neatly, but you could still see the bruises. And the way she carried herself, with her shoulders pulled in and her eyes scanning the room before she even stepped into it, that had not changed at all. "Mr. Holbrook," she said. Her voice sounded stronger today, but it was still cautious, like she was measuring out each word. "Miss Calloway, are you ready?" "I have been ready since 5 o'clock this morning. She is not kidding," Dorothy added. "Get her out of my store before she decides to alphabetize my entire canned goods section." The whole stockroom. Jessie picked up Maggie's only piece of luggage, a beat-up carpet bag that felt like it had nothing in it, and set it in the wagon. He gave her a hand up onto the seat, and she pulled back the instant his fingers touched her arm. It was just a tiny flinch, a quick little recoil, but Jessie saw it and made a mental note. "It is about an hour's ride," he mentioned, settling in beside her. "The snow has made the roads a bit choppy. I walked 12 miles through worse. I reckon I can handle a wagon ride." They traveled without talking for a good while. Jessie was not the kind of fella who needed to fill silence with chatter, and Maggie seemed to appreciate that. She sat bolt upright on the bench with her hands folded neatly in her lap, just watching the scenery roll by with a look on her face that Jessie could not quite figure out. "Your children," she finally said. "You mentioned them yesterday, but I would like to hear more. What are the things I should know that you would not write down in a letter?" Jessie took a moment to think on that. "Lucy is going to try and run you off. Do not let her. She does not want me there. She does not want anybody there who is not her mother. It is not about you personally. It sure feels personal when you are the one getting the cold shoulder. I suppose it does. But Lucy has been carrying this whole family on her little shoulders for 4 years now. She is scared that if somebody else takes the reins, it will mean those 4 years were for nothing. That she was for nothing." Maggie was quiet for a long second. "I understand that feeling all too well. I had a feeling you would. And your little girl, Ellie, you mentioned she doesn't talk. Not to me, anyway. Not to hardly anyone. Sometimes she'll whisper a thing or two to Lucy or talk to the animals. Doc Shaw says there ain't a thing wrong with her physically. He says it is just her way of keeping herself safe from any more pain. Losing her mama at 2 years old, she likely has no memory of her. She does not. But she can feel that something is gone. You can see it clear as day on her face. A kind of emptiness, like a house with no one living in it. She knows something ought to be there. She just does not know what it is." Maggie's eyes started to water. She turned her head to look out at the white hills drifting by and stayed silent for a good few minutes. "I need to tell you something," she finally said. "Before I meet your children, that way you can change your mind if you have a notion to. Go on." "My husband, Virgil Creed, did more than just drink and raise a hand to me. He was a grifter, a swindler through and through. He cheated good folks out of their life savings and used our family name to do it. After he passed, his brother Emmett took his place. And Emmett was worse because Emmett was clever. He spread the word all over Philadelphia that I was Virgil's partner in his schemes, that I helped him plan it all, that I was just as guilty as my dead husband." "Were you?" "No, I was not. But MTT had papers. I believe they were forged, but they looked real enough. He took them to the law. They came to our home. I left before they could put me in cuffs." Jesse kept his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. "So there could be people out there looking for you. There might be. I just do not know. EMTT's influence is far-reaching, but Montana is a far piece from Philadelphia. I am praying it is far enough, and if it turns out it is not," Maggie turned and looked him straight in the eye, "then I will go. I will not bring a lick of trouble down on your family, Mr. Holbrook. You have my solemn promise. The very moment my past puts your children at risk, I will be gone." Jesse pulled the wagon to a halt. The horse huffed and shuffled its feet, ready to get moving in the cold, but Jesse needed a minute. "Miss Calloway, I am about to say something, and I need you to listen real close. I am listening. Every soul here in Silver Creek has a past they are running from. I have got mine. Dorothy has hers. Even Pastor Webb is sitting on secrets he thinks the whole town does not know. What counts out here is not where you came from. It is what you are doing right now. So unless you are about to tell me you actually helped cheat those people, which I do not believe for a second, then your past is your own business. And if trouble finds its way here, well, we will face it together. Maggie just stared at him. Her eyes were shining with an emotion she was fighting hard to keep down. "You do not even know me," she whispered. "I know enough. I know you walked 12 miles in a blizzard to get to my doorstep. I know you flinch if someone touches your arm unexpected, but you will not back away from a hard conversation. I know you straightened up all of Dorothy's ribbons at 5 this morning because sitting idle scares you more than a snowstorm. For now, that is plenty." He gave the reins a snap, and the wagon jolted ahead. Next to him, Maggie covered her mouth with her hand and turned her face away, and Jessie made a point not to notice she was crying. Some things a person ought to be able to do in private, even when they are sitting just 3 feet away from you on a wagon seat. The ranch house appeared on the horizon about 20 minutes later. Maggie wiped her eyes and sat up straight, becoming, right before Jessie's eyes, a woman who was composed and ready for anything. He wondered just how many times she had done that, pulled herself together from one breath to the next, hiding all her hurt behind a calm face. Caleb was right there on the porch. He had clearly been watching for them because the second the wagon came into sight, he shot up and started waving both his arms. "That one's Caleb," Jessie said. "He favors you." "Bless his heart," Maggie laughed. It was a small surprise sound, like she did not expect to find a reason to laugh today. And hearing it hitched something up inside Jesse's chest he was not quite ready to think about. Caleb ran out to the wagon before it even stopped. "You are the lady. Pa said you were coming. Do you know how to make biscuits? Can you ride a horse? Do you like cats? We have got 6 of them now because the barn cat had kittens, and Pa said nobody is drowning anything." "Caleb," Jessie said, "take a breath." "I certainly do know how to make biscuits," Maggie said to the boy, her voice full of warmth. "I cannot ride a horse just yet, but I am a willing student, and I absolutely love cats." "She is perfect," Caleb announced, and he grabbed her hand to pull her up to the house. Inside, Lucy was by the stove, her arms crossed tight over her chest. She was wearing her best dress, which Jessie knew was a sign she was on the defense. Lucy always put on her armor when she felt uneasy. "Lucy, this here is Miss Calloway." "Hello, Lucy," Maggie said. "Your father has told me so much about you. He says you have been holding this family together." And I can tell he was not exaggerating one bit. "This kitchen is cleaner than any I have ever laid eyes on." Lucy's face did not soften. "The spare room is through there. It is small. I am sure it will be just fine. Supper is at 6. I do the cooking. Then I will be happy to help with the cleanup. I do not need any help. I am sure you do not. But more hands always make for lighter work." Lucy sized Maggie up for a long moment, judging her, testing her, searching for the lie. Then she just turned back to the stove. "Ellie is in the bedroom. She will not come out for strangers." "That is perfectly all right," Maggie said. "I'm in no hurry." Jessie led Maggie to the spare room. It was tiny, hardly bigger than the narrow bed and the single wooden chair, but it was warm and spotless. Someone, likely Lucy, had left a folded quilt at the foot of the bed. "It is not much," Jessie began. "It is my own," Maggie said, "and that makes it more than enough." She started to unpack her small bag. Jessie watched her from the doorway as she set out her few belongings. 2 dresses, both black and worn nearly through. A sewing kit and a leather roll, clearly well loved, its needles shiny and sharp. A Bible with a cracked cover. And a small tin-type picture of a woman who had Maggie's same eyes. "My mother," Maggie explained when she saw him looking. "She passed away when I was 17. This is the only thing I have left of her." "I'm sorry to hear that. She was a seamstress, the very best in all of Philadelphia. And folks used to say she could see a dress in a store window and go home and make it from memory. Even better than the one she saw. She taught me everything I know." Maggie gently touched the sewing kit. This was hers. Jessie nodded. He knew the weight of tools passed down, how they carry the memory of the dead into the world of the living. Hannah's gardening tools were still hanging in the barn, right where she left them the day she died. He could not bring himself to use them, but he could not take them down either. "I will let you get settled," he said. "If you need anything, you just holler." He found Caleb in the kitchen, just about jumping out of his skin with excitement. "She is nice, Pa. I told you we needed some help. Can she stay with us forever?" "We will see about that, son. But you like her, do you not? She seems real nice, and she knows biscuits. Biscuits are not the most important thing, Caleb. They are pretty important, though." Jesse headed out to the barn to look in on a pregnant mare and give everybody some breathing room. When he came back inside an hour later, the house smelled different. Not a bad different, just not the same. Maggie had found the herbs Teresa had left behind in the kitchen and was making a soup. A real soup, with vegetables and spices and something that smelled like it was worth sitting down for. Caleb was at the table talking a mile a minute to Maggie as she cooked. She listened and nodded and asked him questions, and the boy just blossomed under her attention like a wildflower getting some unexpected sun. Lucy was not in sight. But when Jesse walked by the girl's bedroom, he heard his oldest daughter's voice, quiet and angry, speaking to someone. "She is not staying. She cannot. Pa does not really want her here. He is just being nice because she is hurt. Once she is all better, she will leave." They all leave. And then, so soft Jesse almost did not catch it, came another voice. Barely a wisp of air, hardly a sound at all. "She smells nice." Jesse stopped dead in his tracks. That was Ellie. Ellie had said something. Not to him, not where he could draw her out. But she had spoken, on her own, for the first time in what felt like forever. 2 little words. About Maggie. He just stood there in the hallway, his hand flat against the wall, and he felt something that had been locked up tight inside his chest for 4 years begin to crack open. It was a feeling that was so terrifying, it had to be hope. At supper, they all sat around the table like a real family for the first time. Lucy insisted on serving the food. Maggie ate her meal slowly, enjoying every single bite like someone who had known hunger not long ago. Caleb chattered on enough for the whole table. Ellie sat in her usual chair, quiet as a mouse with her rag doll next to her. But her eyes kept drifting over to Maggie, watching her with a silent focus that Jesse knew well. It was the same way Ellie watched the barn cats, curious, careful, wanting to move closer but scared of what might happen if she did. After the meal, Maggie offered to do the dishes. Lucy said she would handle it. Maggie said that was fine and asked if she could take a look at the ranch ledgers instead. "I saw a box of paperwork in the front room," she said to Jesse. "Would you mind if I started putting them in order? Help yourself, but I ought to warn you, it is a real hornet's nest. I like a good mess. It keeps my hands busy." She sat right down at the table with the box of receipts and invoices and got right to it, sorting the papers into stacks with movements that were fast and certain. From the other side of the room, Jesse kept an eye on her, pretending to be lost in the almanac Caleb had left behind. Lucy stepped out from the kitchen, a dish towel in her hands, and froze when she saw Maggie at work. A look washed over her face, something tangled and young that wasn't quite anger. "What are you doing with Pa's papers?" she demanded. "Putting them in some kind of order. Your father's been overpaying for feed. I aim to find out by how much and for how long." "How do you figure he's paying too much?" "Because I took a gander at the prices in the general store catalog and put them up against these invoices. The difference is a whole lot." Lucy, drawn in against her will, moved a little closer. "How much is a whole lot?" "Enough to buy a brand new winter coat for every single person in this house. Maybe even 2 of them. Lucy glanced at the papers, then back at Maggie. Something in her expression cracked. It wasn't acceptance, not just yet, but it was a start. "I could surely use a new coat," Lucy said, her voice low. "Mine's gotten too small." "Well, then we'll make sure your father quits getting swindled, and maybe we can fix that." Lucy stood there a second more. Then she turned and walked to her room, but the door didn't slam this time. She closed it gently, almost like she was leaving it open just a hair. Jessie set the almanac down. Maggie glanced up from her papers, and their eyes met across the quiet room. Not a word was spoken. None was needed. The lamp flame danced between them, throwing long shadows that stretched across the walls. Outside, the wind pressed on the house like it was a living creature. And on the inside, for the first time in 4 years, the silence felt less like an empty ache and more like the deep breath taken right before something new starts. Maggie had been on the ranch for 9 days when she finally heard Ellie laugh. She was in the spare room, mending a tear at the shoulder of Caleb's shirt. That boy tore through his clothes like a grass fire through a dry field, and Lucy had been patching them up with mismatched pieces of flour sacks that never held for long. Maggie had taken over the mending without a word, and Lucy had let her without a fight, which was about as much of a blessing as Maggie figured she'd get. The laugh floated in from the front room. It was small and quick, gone almost before Maggie even recognized it. But she knew that sound didn't belong to Caleb, whose laugh was loud and frequent, or to Lucy, who hadn't laughed a single time since Maggie showed up. She put the shirt down and moved to the doorway. Ellie was sitting right there on the floor, with one of the barn kittens, a little gray tabby that had slipped out of the barn and squeezed inside through a space under the kitchen door. The kitten was busy chasing its own tail, spinning around in tight little circles. Ellie was watching it, her hand clamped over her mouth as if she was trying to trap the laughter inside. But a little bit had escaped anyway, just for a moment, and now she just sat there, looking surprised by her own happiness. Maggie stayed put, not making a sound. She'd learned in 9 days that getting near Ellie was like walking up on a doe. Any quick move, any look held too long, and the little girl would pull back into her silence like a rabbit diving into its den. The kitten finally tumbled over and landed flat on its back. Ellie let out another noise, not a full laugh this time, but something close. Her fingers reached out light as a feather and touched the kitten's soft belly. The kitten latched onto her hand with all 4 paws and started chewing on her thumb. Maggie backed away from the doorway real slow and went back to her sewing. She didn't say anything about it to Jesse when he came in for supper. Some things are just too delicate to be talked about. You have to let them grow on their own. That night, long after the children were asleep, Jesse poured her a cup of coffee and sat down at the table while she went over the books. "You found something else," he said. It wasn't a question. He had already learned to read the tension in her shoulders when she got riled up over numbers. "Your property tax assessment from last year is all wrong," Maggie said. "Somebody put a value on your north pasture that's 3 times what it's actually worth. That's the reason your tax bill shot up so high." "I did wonder about that. Just thought it was the county raising all the rates." "It's not the county, it's the assessor." "Who does the assessments for your land?" Jesse's whole demeanor changed. "Orrin Flagg. He's with the county office over in Helena." "And who does Orrin Flagg share a drink with every Saturday night down at the saloon?" Jesse was quiet for a long moment. "Wade Prescott. Your tax bill last year was $112 more than it ought to have been. The year before that, $87 more. Wade Prescott has been bleeding you dry through the tax office, Jesse. Just slow enough so you wouldn't notice, but fast enough to keep you struggling." Jesse flattened his hands on the table. Maggie watched his knuckles turn white. She'd seen that kind of anger before, the quiet kind. The sort that didn't explode, but just smoldered hot and steady like embers buried in ash. "How much in total?" he asked. "Over 3 years, it's about $300. That's money I could have used to fix the barn roof. Money I could have spent to buy Lucy a decent winter coat instead of letting her shiver in one that's 2 sizes too small for her." "I know. Can you prove any of this?" "I can prove the assessment is dead wrong. I can pull the values for similar land in the county and show them the difference. Now, whether that's enough to prove Flagg did it on purpose, I can't say. But it's more than enough to demand they do it over and get your money back." Jesse just looked at her from across the table. The lamplight fell on the bruise on her cheek. It was still fading, but you could see it, a reminder of everything she had to endure to get here. "You've saved me more in 9 days than most folks make in a whole year," he said. "All I did was look at the numbers. The numbers have been here all along, but nobody else ever took the time to look." Maggie didn't reply to that. She drank the last of her coffee and turned back to the account books. And Jesse just sat there, looking at her with an expression he likely thought she couldn't read, but she could. She had spent her entire life watching people's faces. That's how you stay alive when you live with a dangerous man. You learn to notice every twitch, every change, every clenching of the jaw. What she saw in Jesse's face wasn't danger. It was thankfulness that was turning into something more, something he wasn't ready to put a name to yet. She wasn't ready either, but she could feel it, sitting there between them like a whole other person at the table, just being patient, just waiting. 2 days after that, the real storm hit. Jesse had been eyeing the sky all morning, reading the clouds just like Maggie read numbers. "A big one's coming," he said to Buck Morrison, his foreman, who had just ridden in from his cabin on the South Ridge. "Get the cattle down into the sheltered draw. Bring the horses into the barn. We've got maybe 4 hours." Buck, a quiet man of about 50, who had worked for Jesse since before Hannah passed, just gave a nod and rode off. For the next 3 hours, Jesse hauled firewood, battened down the shutters, and filled every bucket and barrel he could find with water from the well. If the storm was half as bad as he figured, they could be snowed in for days. Maggie pitched in without needing to be asked. She moved the food supplies to the warmest spot in the kitchen, stuffed old rags into the gaps beneath the doors, and made sure they had enough blankets and candles to last a whole week. She worked with a calm efficiency, like someone who had gotten ready for trouble before. "You've done this before," Jessie said, watching her pack rags into a window frame. "Philadelphia gets some bad winters, too. My mother and I made it through the blizzard of '78. We were snowed in for 3 days with no heat. She taught me that being prepared is what separates surviving from suffering." By late afternoon, the storm slammed into them. The wind hit first, a howling monster that rattled the house right down to its foundation. Then came the snow, falling so thick and fast that the barn completely vanished behind a solid white curtain in just a few minutes. The temperature fell like a rock tossed off a canyon rim. They all huddled in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house. Jesse kept feeding the fire until it was roaring. Caleb had his face pressed against the window pane, watching the blizzard with the kind of wild excitement only a boy can have. Lucy sat in her chair, knitting like her life depended on it. Ellie was on the floor with her little rag doll and the gray kitten, which had started following her everywhere. Maggie made a soup out of what they had on hand: potatoes, some salt pork, dried beans, and the very last of the carrots from the root cellar. She threw in some herbs that made the whole kitchen smell like a place you'd want to come home to, and even Lucy took a second bowl without a word of complaint. The storm raged on all through the night. Jesse stayed awake to feed the fire, check on the windows, and listen to the wind as it probed every single weak spot in the old house. Maggie stayed up right there with him. They sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table and didn't say much. But the quiet between them had turned into something comfortable, a shared piece of calm that didn't need to be filled with words. Around midnight, Maggie heard it, a cough coming from the girl's bedroom. It was small, wet, and all wrong. She went to the door and just listened. Another cough followed by a wheezing sound that turned her blood to ice. She eased the door open and saw Ellie sitting straight up in her bed, her face all red. Her breathing was shallow, and each one seemed like a fight. The little girl's skin was hotter than a branding iron. "Jesse." And he was by her side in 3 long strides. He took one look at Ellie, and the color drained right out from under his tan. "No," he said, his voice low. "Not this again. Get me some cold water and clean rags, right now." Jesse was gone in a flash. Maggie scooped Ellie up from the bed, and the child was as limp and hot as a skillet on the fire. Her breathing had a deep rattle to it that Maggie recognized, a sound she had heard before. It was the sound that told you the sickness had settled in the lungs. "Lucy," Maggie called out. "Wake up, honey. I'm going to need your help." Lucy showed up in the doorway, saw her little sister, and her face went ghost white. "What is the matter with her? She is burning up with a fever and she can barely breathe. I need you to keep that kitchen fire good and hot. Do you think you can do that? Is she going to pass away? Lucy's voice broke on the last few words. All that tough girl act, all those walls she built, they came tumbling down in a second, and she was just a scared 11-year-old girl staring at her sister. Not on my watch, Maggie said with steel in her voice. Get that fire going. Lucy took off running. Jessie returned with the water and rags, and Maggie got right to work. She slipped off Ellie's nightgown and started wrapping her in cool, damp cloths to try and break the fever. The little girl whimpered, but did not fight it, which scared Maggie more than any thrashing would have. We have to get Doc Shaw, Jessie said. His voice was steady, but she could see his hands were shaking. You cannot ride out in this storm. You would be dead before you ever made it to town. I cannot just stand here and watch her fade. You are not going to watch her. You are going to help me save her. Jessie, you look at me. He looked, and his eyes were wild with a fear Maggie understood completely. He was right back in that awful room 4 years ago, watching Hannah slip through his fingers, feeling helpless, useless, unable to do a single thing to stop what was taking the person he loved. This is not the same, Maggie said, her voice firm as an oak tree. Ellie is not Hannah. I am not about to let her go, but I need you with me and I need you steady. Can you do that for me? Jessie pulled in a deep breath and then another one. The wild look in his eyes backed off, replaced by something harder. By resolve. Just tell me what you need me to do. I need my sewing kit, the one from the spare room. It is a leather roll. Inside that roll, there is a small cloth pouch filled with dried herbs, remedies from my grandmother, and I need hot water. As hot as you can possibly get it. Jessie brought her everything she asked for. Maggie opened the little herb pouch and started sorting through the dried plants, hearing their names in her mother's voice, in her grandmother's voice. She heard generations of women who healed folks with what the good Lord provided when a doctor was too far or cost too much. She made a poultice first, mixing mustard seed and dried thyme with hot water until it was a paste. She spread it on a clean cloth and laid it gentle-like across Ellie's little chest. The child flinched from the heat of it, but she did not cry out. Her eyes were open now, but they were glassy with fever, just staring off into nowhere. Ellie, Maggie said, her voice soft. Can you hear me, sweet girl? I need you to try and take a big old breath. I know it must hurt something fierce, but you have to try. Ellie's eyes finally found Maggie's face. A little something flickered in them. Maybe it was recognition, or maybe trust, or maybe just not being scared anymore. She took a breath. It was shallow and wet, with that rattle still in it, but it was a little deeper than before. Good girl, try again. Maggie brewed a tea from willow bark and elderberry, just the way her grandmother had shown her. Getting Ellie to drink it was the hardest part of all. The little girl gagged on the bitter stuff, and half of it came right back up. But Maggie was patient as the day is long, spooning tiny little bits past Ellie's cracked lips, waiting, then spooning some more. Caleb appeared in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Is Ellie sick? She has a fever, Maggie told him. She's going to be just fine, but she needs it to be real quiet. Can you be a brave big brother for me and head on back to bed? I want to stay here. I know you do, honey, but the best way you can help your sister right now is to get your rest, so you can take good care of her tomorrow. Can you do that for me? Caleb gave a solemn little nod and went back to his room. Jessie watched the whole thing happen with a look of awe. He had never known how to talk to his own kids about being scared. He just gritted his teeth and pushed through it, expecting them to do the same. Maggie, she just called it what it was, acknowledged it, and then gave them something to do about it. It was a different kind of strength from his own, and he was just starting to realize how much he truly needed it. The long hours just crawled on by. Ellie's fever kept climbing, no matter the poultice, no matter the tea, no matter what Maggie tried. By 2 in the morning, the child was delirious, her little body burning up, her breath coming in short little gasps, like she was fighting for everyone. Lucy sat huddled in a corner of the kitchen, her knees pulled up tight to her chest, with tears just streaming down her face in silence. She had given up on trying to be strong. She was just a little girl watching her sister die, and the terror in her eyes was the rawest thing Jesse had ever seen in his life. "She is not getting any better," Jesse said. His voice was flat and empty. It was the voice of a man getting ready for the worst to happen. Maggie flat out refused to accept that. She changed out the poultice, brewed a stronger tea, and sponged Ellie's burning skin with cold water until her own hands were numb. She never stopped talking to the child, a low, steady murmur of words. Their meaning did not matter, but the sound of her voice did. It was a voice in the dark, something to hold on to. "My mama used to sing to me when I got sick," Maggie murmured, pressing a cool rag to Ellie's forehead. She had this voice. Wasn't what you'd call pretty, but it was warm, like a warm quilt made of just her voice. She'd sing about rivers and green hills and places she'd never even seen. And I would listen, and somehow the fever would not seem so scary just because her voice was there. Maggie did not sing, but she kept on talking, telling Ellie about her mother's sewing shop, about all the dresses they had made together, about the way the sunlight would stream through the shop window in the afternoon and turn the bolts of fabric to pure gold. Just small, ordinary stories about a life that was now gone. She told them, not because Ellie could understand a word, but because the sound of a woman's voice, steady and gentle and unafraid, was the kind of medicine no herb could ever replace. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Ellie's breathing changed. Maggie felt the change before she even heard it. A little bit of an easing, a little deeper. The rattle was still there, but it was fainter now, like a storm moving off into the distance. "Her skin feels cooler," Jesse said. He had his hand on Ellie's forehead, and his voice was full of that shaky hope of a man who had been braced for the worst and found a miracle instead. Maggie felt for the child's pulse. It was stronger, steadier. "The fever is breaking," she said. "Thank the good Lord, the fever is breaking." Lucy made a small sound from her corner. It was a sob she had been holding back for hours, finally letting go. She scrambled across the wooden floor to her sister's bed and took Ellie's little hand, pressing it against her own tear-stained cheek. "Don't you ever do that to me again," Lucy whispered, fierce and low. "Don't you ever scare me like that again." Ellie's eyes fluttered open. They were clear as a blue sky now, no longer glassy with the fever. She looked at Lucy was there. She glanced over at Jessie. Then her eyes fell on Maggie, who knelt right beside her with dark shadows under her eyes and the stain of herbs on her hands, her face a picture of weary relief. "You stayed," Ellie whispered. Just 2 little words, and they were not for Lucy or for Jessie. They were for Maggie. It was the first time in 4 long years she had spoken a word to anyone outside her own kin. Tears welled up in Maggie's eyes. She gently took Ellie's small hand into her own. "Of course I stayed. Mama left. She just went away and never came back." A broken sound escaped Jesse's throat. He had to turn away, pressing a fist to his mouth as his shoulders began to shake. 4 years. 4 whole years of nothing but silence. And these were the words his little girl had kept locked up inside. This was the hurt she had been nursing all this time. "Your mama never wanted to leave you," Maggie said, her voice soft as cotton. "She got sick the very same way you did tonight. But she didn't have anybody to make her that special medicine. If she had, she would have stayed. She would have stayed with you forever because mothers do not leave their babies on purpose." "Promise?" "I promise." "Are you going to leave?" Maggie just looked at this little girl, this quiet, wounded 6-year-old child who had just placed more faith in her than any grown-up had in a long, long time. And right then, she made a promise she had no business making. It was a promise that could very well break her heart. It was a promise she meant with every piece of her soul. "I am not going anywhere, sweetheart." Ellie's small fingers squeezed Maggie's hand a little tighter. Then her eyes drifted closed, and she fell asleep. It was a true sleep this time, a deep and peaceful rest, the kind of sleep a child has only when they feel truly safe. Lucy just sat there staring at Maggie, her expression having nothing to do with being cross and everything to do with the feeling she was still too young to understand. She talked to you. Lucy said it like she couldn't believe it. She actually talked to you. She was ready to. Maggie said she just needed to be sure it was safe. Lucy opened her mouth, then closed it, and then opened it again. "Thank you," she said. The words sounded like they took a heavy toll on her for saving her sister. "You do not have to thank me, Lucy. Yes, I do, because I have been just awful to you, and you stayed here anyway, and you saved my sister and me." Lucy's strong front finally crumbled. She started to cry then, a real cry, the way children weep when they have been holding it all in for far too long. "I am so tired of being afraid. I am so tired of having to take care of everything. I just want someone to take care of me for a change." Maggie opened her arms wide, and Lucy collapsed into them like a wall giving way. The young girl sobbed against Maggie's chest, and Maggie just held her close, rocking her just like she imagined Hannah would have, the same way her own mother had held her when the world felt too heavy to bear. "You have been so brave," Maggie whispered into Lucy's hair. "So very, very brave. But you do not have to carry it all by yourself anymore. I am here now." Jesse stood in the doorway, just watching his daughters held in the arms of a woman he had known for less than 2 weeks. Tears streamed down his face, and he did not even try to wipe them away. He had spent 4 years trying to keep this family together with hard work and silence and pure stubbornness. And this woman, this tired, bruised, remarkable woman, had managed to do in 9 days what he could not do in 4 years. She had reached his children. She had broken right through the walls of sorrow and fear and silence that he had not even been able to see, much less tear down. When Lucy had finally cried herself out and fallen asleep in the chair next to Ellie's bed, Maggie gently covered her with a blanket and then walked into the kitchen. Jesse was there, sitting at the table with his head buried in his hands. "She is going to be just fine," Maggie said. "Both of them will be." Jesse looked up at her. His face was a wreck, stripped clean of every wall he had ever put up. "I could not save Hannah," he said. "She passed away in that very room while the snow was falling, and there was not a thing I could do. I rode for the doctor, but he got here too late. And she died all alone because I was not with her. I was out in that storm looking for help that never came. And she died all alone." Maggie sat down in the chair across from him. "She knew you were trying. It was not enough. Jesse, it was a blizzard and a high fever. You could not control either one of those things. I was the one who brought her out here. Montana was my dream. She wanted to stay back in Missouri, close to her family, close to doctors. But I wanted land. I wanted to build something of my own. And she came along because she loved me, and it ended up killing her. You did not kill her. That fever killed her. If we had been in Missouri, you do not know that. People die from scarlet fever in Missouri, too. They die from it in Philadelphia and New York and everywhere else. You cannot outrun sickness just by changing where you live." Jesse was quiet for a long while after that. The fire crackled in the hearth. The wind howled against the cabin walls. Somewhere inside the house, one of the girls turned over in her sleep. "You sound just like her," he finally said. "Hannah, she always used to say that worrying about things you cannot control is just borrowing trouble from tomorrow." A smart woman, she was. She was the smartest person I ever knew. He took a short breath. "Until I met you." Maggie just shook her head. "I am not smart. I am just stubborn. There is a big difference. You can call it whatever you want to. You saved my daughter's life tonight. You got Ellie to speak. You made Lucy cry. And I mean that as the highest praise I know how to give, because that little girl has not shed a tear since her mother's funeral. She's been carrying 4 years of grief inside her like a heavy stone. And you cracked it wide open in just one night. They were ready. They just needed somebody to show them it was safe to let it all out. And you showed them." "I tried to." Jesse reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm and steady. Maggie flinched just a tiny bit, an old habit, but then she did not pull her hand away. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I should have told you this before you ever came to this ranch. It is about Wade Prescott." Jesse's eyes went wide. "How did you know that name?" "Because I have been looking over your books for 9 days, and Wade Prescott's name is connected to half of the troubles I have found. The high prices for feed came through a supplier he has ties to. The tax assessment was handled by his man down at the county office. And 3 years ago, you took out a loan from the Silver Creek Bank, which Wade Prescott just happens to have a controlling share in. A loan with terms that are made to slowly bleed you dry until you cannot pay. Am I wrong about that?" Jesse just stared at her. "You figured all of that out just from the account books. Numbers tell stories, Jesse. You just have to know how to read them. Wade Prescott has been trying to take this ranch from you for years. He's doing it slowly with money, through the system, and through the people he has in his pocket. And if I had to make a guess, I would say the real reason you sent for a mail-order bride was not just because your children need a mother. It is because Montana law protects a married man's homestead from his creditors, and you needed a wife to keep Prescott from taking your land." The quiet that hung in the air after she said that was the loudest thing Maggie had ever heard. "Yes," Jesse said, his voice low. "That is part of it." "Is it most of it?" "It was. At the very beginning, when I first wrote that letter, I was looking for a legal protection, not a real person. I'm ashamed of that now. You should be. I know. You should have told me the truth. I know that too." Maggie pulled her hand away from his, not really out of anger, but something mighty close to it. "I came here running from a man who used me, a man who married me for what I could do for him and never once cared about who I was as a person. If that is what this is, it is not." Jesse's voice was raw with feeling. "It started out that way, and I will admit to that. But it is not that anymore. Not after what happened tonight. Not after watching you save my daughter and get through to Ellie and hold Lucy while she sobbed. Maggie, I have not felt a single thing for anyone in 4 years. I thought that part of me had died right along with Hannah, but it did not. It was just frozen solid, and you, well, you are thawing it out. And it scares me nearly to death, because I do not deserve it." Maggie looked at him for a good long while. She saw a man who had made a selfish decision and knew it was wrong. A man who was telling her the honest truth, even though it could make her walk away. A man who was not afraid of the storm raging outside, but of the one churning inside of him. Virgil had never once told her the truth about anything. Not one time in 6 years of marriage had he ever given her the respect of honesty. And here was Jesse Holbrook, laying out the very worst part of himself and letting her decide what to do with it. "Do not lie to me again," she said. "Not about anything. Ever. I have had my fill of men who lie. I will not. And do not you decide what I need to know and what I do not. If there is trouble coming our way, I need to see it coming. I cannot protect this family if I am walking around blind. You are right. And Jesse, yes. The next time you need help, you ask for it honestly. Do not dress it up and pretend it is something else. I would much rather be needed for the truth than be wanted for a lie." Jesse nodded his head. Something settled down between them in that moment. It felt less like romance and more like a foundation. Something solid and level, built to carry a heavy load. "Wade Prescott holds the papers on this ranch," Maggie said, getting right back to business, her voice steady now. "I have seen the loan terms, and they are designed to cheat you. But whoever did this was also sloppy. There are mistakes in the interest charges, things that do not add up in the payment records. If he's been doing to you what he has been doing through the tax office and the feed store, then that loan paper might just fall apart if you look at it hard enough. You really think you can fight him? I think I can find the truth. And from what I have seen in my life, the truth is the most powerful weapon a person can have. Men like Wade Prescott, they build their power on a foundation of lies and confusion. You take that away from them, and they do not have a thing left." Jesse just looked at this woman sitting there across from him, with bruises on her face and a fire in her eyes, and he knew with perfect clarity that Margaret Calloway was the most remarkable woman he had ever laid eyes on. "Then you find it," he said. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes you to do it, you find the truth." Maggie gave a single nod and pulled the box of papers closer. Outside, the storm kept on raging, burying Silver Creek under a foot of fresh snow. Inside, a 6-year-old girl was sleeping sound for the first time in 4 years. An 11-year-old girl slept with dried tears on her cheeks, and an 8-year-old boy dreamed of biscuits and kittens, and the nice lady who had come to stay with them. And right there at the kitchen table, in the light of one single lamp, Maggie Calloway started the hard work of saving Jesse Holbrook's ranch. Not because he had asked her to do it, not because she owed him a single thing, but because this was her home, and she was fixin' to fight for it with everything she had. Maggie worked straight through the rest of that night and the whole next day. She laid Jesse's papers out across the kitchen table, then they spread to the floor, and finally into the front room. It created a spider web of deals that told a story stretching back 7 long years. By the time the storm finally gave up on the second morning, she had found her truth. "He's been at this since Hannah passed away," she said to Jesse. "That's when it all began. The sky-high feed prices, the crooked tax numbers, that loan with terms nobody could meet. It all kicked off within 6 months of your wife's death. He just waited until you were hurting and not thinking straight, and then he started to put the screws to you." Jesse just stood at the window watching the snow fall quiet and still. Wade always had a nose for a man's weak spot. "This isn't just a knack, Jesse. This is a whole system. He's not only doing it to you. Look here." Maggie held up a handful of papers she had dug out from the bottom of the box. "These are from your neighbor, Tom Avery. You bought hay from him 2 years back. Just look at the price he gave you." Tom was always square with his prices. He was. But then look at this bill from 6 months after that. Tom sold his whole spread and lit out for Oregon. And you know who bought his land? Wade Prescott, for pennies on the dollar. And here is the real kicker. Tom Avery's property taxes doubled the year right before he sold out. It is the same exact pattern as yours. Oren Flagg jacked up the value. Tom could not pay the higher taxes, and Wade came in with a buyout that was plain robbery. Jesse turned away from the window. Lord have mercy, how many folks has he done this to? From what I can tell, at least 4 ranchers in the last 6 years. He's taken over Silver Creek, one ruined family at a time. And the reason no one's caught on is that no one has seen the whole picture. Each rancher just sees his own trouble. They don't realize all their troubles are tied together. Not until you. Not until me. Jesse finally sat down across from her. "So what is our play? We're going to need the other ranchers. If I am right, every one of them holds a piece of this thing. Receipts, tax bills, loan papers. On its own, each story just looks like a string of bad luck. But put them together and they show a downright crooked operation. I have to see their paperwork to prove it, though. Most of those folks are long gone. Moved on or scattered to the wind. Not all of them. Dorothy knows every soul who's come or gone from Silver Creek in the last 30 years. If anybody can help me find the ones that are left, it's her." The roads were still covered under 3 feet of snow, so Jesse hitched up the big draft horse to the sled, and they started the slow haul into town. Maggie carried her proof. Jesse carried his rifle, not because he was looking for a fight, but because Wade Prescott had spies in every shadow, and a man who spent 7 years cheating folks out of their land would not be happy with someone poking holes in his scheme. Dorothy Perkins listened to every word as Maggie laid her papers across the store counter. She never once cut in. She did not gasp. She just paid attention with the kind of sharp focus that came from 55 years of surviving in a tough land by noticing things other people were blind to. "I knew it," Dorothy finally said when Maggie was done. "I have known in my bones for years that something was rotten. Ranches going under, families pulling up stakes, and Wade Prescott just getting fatter and fatter while everyone else around him got poorer. But knowing something and proving it are 2 different horses. Can you help me find the people he did this to? Anyone still around who might have kept their papers?" "Sarah Avery, Tom's wife. She's over in Billings with her sister. They left in a real hurry, but Sarah never threw nothing away. She'll have every last piece of paper Tom ever laid a hand on. Then there is Hector Ruiz. He used to run cattle south of here. Wade ran him off 3 years ago, but Hector did not go too far. He is working as a hired hand over at the Miller place, 20 miles east. And you got Martha Kincaid. No. Relation to your people, Jesse. She lost her ranch the same year Hannah passed. She is still right here in Silver Creek working over at the boarding house. Can you get a message to them? I can do you one better. I can get them to come here. But Maggie, you have to understand one thing. Wade Prescott is not just a snake. He is a rattler with friends. He has got Orrin Flagg on his payroll and half the county officials, too. On top of that, he has got money, lawyers, and men who do whatever he says. If he gets wind of what you are doing before you are ready, he will not just try to stop you. He will grind you into dust. He can try, Maggie said, her voice steady. I am serious, child. The last man who stood up to Wade Prescott was some newspaper fella from Helena who came here sniffing around 3 years ago. He left town with 2 busted ribs and a real clear hint that the Montana air was bad for his lungs. Jesse's hand twitched toward his hip where his Colt would normally be. He had left it back at the ranch. We will be careful. Careful is not going to cut it. You need the law on your side before you make a move. The sheriff is a good man, but he is just one man with one deputy in a town where Wade Prescott gives half the folks their paycheck. You need somebody with real power. The United States Marshal's Office, Maggie stated. Dorothy and Jesse both stared at her. If Wade Prescott has been filing phony documents with the county, that is more than just stealing. That is fraud against the entire territorial government. The Marshal's office up in Helena has the authority here. You sure know your way around the law for a woman who sews for a living, Dorothy observed, and her tone was less suspicious and more like she was impressed. I know a whole lot about fraud, Maggie answered. I was married to a man who made a career out of it. I learned every trick by watching him use them on other folks. The only difference is I am aiming to use what I know to bring a man like that down. Dorothy smiled, the kind of smile that could make a strong man real nervous. I do believe I am starting to like you, Margaret Calloway. Call me Maggie, and I like you too, Dorothy. Now, can you write a letter to the Marshal's office? My handwriting is decent, but your name carries a hell of a lot more water in this territory than mine does. I will get it written today, but it is going to take a while. Mail crawls in the winter, and the law crawls even slower. You could be looking at weeks before you hear anything back. Then we will use every minute we have got to build a case so strong it will stand on its own. Jesse, I need to look at your loan papers again. Every single line, every single word. If there are mistakes in how they figured the interest, I want to find each and every one. And I would like to speak with Martha Kincaid today, if that is possible. Martha Kincaid was a tall, wiry woman of 45, with hands like worn leather and eyes that had seen too many hopes dry up to ever expect any good news. She listened to Maggie's whole theory in a back room of the boarding house. Her face was a closed book. My husband passed away owing Wade Prescott $800, Martha said. At least that's what Prescott's man of the law claimed. But Henry, he swore on a stack of Bibles that he'd settled that debt. Said he had the papers to prove it. But when we went to find them, they'd vanished. Somebody had gotten into our house while we were at Sunday service and cleaned us out of every last financial paper. When did this happen? The spring of 1883. Henry passed that summer. His heart just gave up on him. Doc Shaw called it the strain, but I know better. Wade Prescott killed my Henry just as sure as if he'd put a gun to his head. He just used paper and ink instead of lead. Do you have anything left? Any paper at all? Martha paused for a moment. Then she dug deep into her apron pocket and her hand came out with a little worn-out envelope. Henry gave this to me the day before he died. He said to keep it tucked away safe and tell no soul. I have held onto it for 4 years, wondering what I ought to do. Inside that envelope was a handwritten receipt from March of 1883, signed by Wade Prescott himself. It confirmed Henry Kincaid's debt was paid in full. $800, all paid up and settled. Maggie's hands shook just a little as she held it. Wade stole your papers to get rid of the proof, but your husband had already secured a receipt. Henry was a cautious man. He never did trust Wade, not even when they were partners in business. He made sure to get everything down in writing. Martha, this right here proves Wade Prescott came to collect on a debt that was already settled. That is not just wrong, it is fraud. And when you put it together with what I uncovered in Jesse's books, it shows his whole crooked way of doing things. Martha's eyes finally filled with tears she must have been holding back for a long, long time. Can you truly put an end to it? I have seen that man bleed this town dry for 10 years, and not a single person has ever laid a glove on him. I can stop him, Maggie declared. But I'm going to need you. I need you to stand up and tell the marshal what happened when the time is right. Can you do that? For my Henry, I would walk through hell and back. For the next 2 weeks, Maggie put her case together like a master builder, fueled by the fire of someone who knew exactly how it felt to have it all taken away. Dorothy's letters brought Sarah Avery all the way from Billings with a heavy trunk of Tom's old paperwork. Hector Ruiz came in from the Miller Ranch carrying his own pile of records, his face set like stone with the fury of a man who had lost his land and his way of life to a cheat. The particulars of each tale were different, but the blueprint was the same. Phony assessments, greedy loans, vanished papers, and smack in the middle of it all was Wade Prescott, pulling the strings and snatching up land like a spider in its web. Maggie laid it all out, creating one single damning story. She checked the dates, the dollar amounts, and the signatures against each other. She discovered the very same penmanship on several forged papers. It was not Wade's handwriting, but it belonged to someone on his payroll. She tallied up the total amount he had swindled from the ranchin' families of Silver Creek over 6 years. The final number was enough to make Dorothy plant herself in a chair. $14,000. Dorothy whispered, "He has taken $14,000 from his own neighbors, and that is just what I can show on paper. The true amount is likely much higher." Jesse had been standing quiet by the door, and he finally spoke. "The marshal's office sent a wire. Deputy Marshal James Colton is headed to Silver Creek. He should be here by the end of January. He has been looking into Prescott's dealings up in Helena. Looks like we are not the only folks who have seen what he is up to." "How long does that give us?" Maggie asked. 2 weeks. Could be less if this good weather keeps up. That will be enough time. I just need one last thing. And what is that? Prescott's own books. Everything I have got so far is from the folks he wronged. It is a strong case, but a slick lawyer could claim each one was a separate mistake, that there was not any grand scheme. But if I can get my hands on Prescott's private ledgers, his real books, I can prove where the money came from every single rancher he has cheated. That is the linchpin that holds it all together. And just how are you fixin' to get your hands on Wade Prescott's personal books? Jesse asked. His voice had the sound of a man who already guessed the answer and was not happy about it one bit. "Orrin Flagg," Maggie said plainly. "He has been Wade's man down at the county office for years, and he has also been pocketing a little extra for himself off Wade's schemes. I saw the proof right in your own tax papers. Flagg bumped up your assessment by $112, but only 80 of it went to Wade. Flagg helped himself to the rest. So if Wade ever learns his own man has been robbing him blind, Flagg would do just about anything to cover his tracks," Dorothy added, "including turning on Wade." "Exactly. That is a dangerous game," Jesse warned. "All of this is dangerous. But Flagg is a yellow-bellied coward. I've seen him around town. He drinks more than he should. His mouth runs, and he starts sweating through his shirt collar whenever Wade's name is mentioned. The man is scared to death. And scared men, they make bargains." Jesse just stared at Maggie for a good long while. "I do not want you going anywhere near Orrin Flagg." "Jesse, I mean it. Wade Prescott is one thing, but a man like Flagg is a wild card. If he gets spooked, he will bolt. And if he bolts, everything he knows goes with him. We would lose our only real shot. I need to get to him before he gets wind of what is coming. Before Wade does, then I am going with you." "No, If you walk in there with me, Flag will smell a rat right away. A lady looking at ribbon in the general store who just happens to strike up a chat? Nobody would look twice at that. But a rancher with a bone to pick standing right behind her? That is a clear and present danger. Jesse purely hated the idea. Maggie could see it plain as day in the set of his shoulders and the hard line of his jaw. His hands kept balling into fists and then unclenching, like he was searching for something to grab hold of. He was a man who got things done, who fixed problems with his own two hands. Letting somebody else walk into danger just was not in his nature. "You gotta trust me on this," Maggie said softly. "I have dealt with men a whole lot more dangerous than Orrin Flagg. That is what has got me so worried." She caught up with Flagg on a Tuesday afternoon in the saloon, which was his usual spot on a Tuesday. He was drinking by himself, which was not his habit, but he was sweating buckets in the cold, which was. Maggie slid into the chair opposite him without an invitation. Flagg jumped, looking up with cloudy, wary eyes. "Mr. Flagg, my name is Margaret Calloway. I am employed over at the Holbrook Ranch. I know who you are. You are Holbrook's mail order woman. I am his bookkeeper, and I have been looking over his financial papers with great interest, especially his tax assessments." Flagg's face turned a pale, sickly color. "I do not have the slightest idea what you are talking about." "Oh, I reckon you do. I reckon you have been cooking the books on property assessments for Wade Prescott for the last 6 years, and I reckon you have been skimming your own share off the top of every single one. And I would bet my last dollar Wade Prescott has no idea you have been shorting him. You cannot prove a thing. I can prove every last word of it. I have got the assessment papers, the true property values, and the difference between what you told Wade and what you really billed. The numbers do not lie, Mr. Flagg. You have been stealing from your own boss." Flagg's hand was trembling so hard he sloshed his whiskey right over the glass. "What is it you want from me?" "I want Wade Prescott's private financial ledgers. His real set of books. The ones that detail where all the money is really going. I do not have them." "No, but you know who does." Flagg did not say a word. His shifty eyes flicked from the door to the window and back to the door again. "Mr. Flagg, a deputy United States Marshal is on his way to Silver Creek. He is coming here for the sole purpose of looking into Wade Prescott's land acquisitions. And when he gets here, he's going to find a meticulously prepared case, built on the sworn statements of every rancher Wade has wronged over the past 6 years. Your name comes up in that case quite a bit. I was only doing what I was told. The marshal will not give a hoot about that. But what he might care about is your cooperation. He might care if you offered up evidence that helped put Prescott away. Folks who cooperate usually get treated a whole lot better than folks who do not." Flagg just gawked at her. She could practically see the wheels turning behind his bloodshot eyes. The fear of Wade Prescott was battling the fear of a jail cell. His own survival was fighting against any loyalty he had. It was not much of a fight. "He has a ledger," Flagg finally mumbled, "kept in the safe at his house. It is black leather with a gold clasp. Every deal he has ever cut is in that book. Every payment, every handout, every last dollar he has squeezed from every family he has put under his thumb. How do I get my hands on it? You do not. That safe is locked up tight in his office, and Wade carries the only key on him day and night. You would have to just walk into his house and take it, or you would need somebody to bring it to you." Flagg froze up completely. "You want me to steal from Wade Prescott? I'm asking you to save your own skin. When that marshal gets here and opens up that ledger, every single name inside is going to face the music. But if you are the man who handed over the proof, well, then you become a witness instead of a defendant. It is the only move you have got left that makes any sense, Mr. Flagg. And deep down, I believe you know that." Flagg mopped up the last of his spilled whiskey from the tabletop with his finger and licked it clean. It was the action of a man at the end of his rope, and men like that can be a great help or a great danger. Maggie watched him, quiet and patient. "Wednesday nights," Flagg whispered. "Wade plays cards over at the Silver Dollar. He is out of the house from 7 o'clock until midnight. His foreman is always with him. The whole place is empty. And the key? He keeps a spare. It is in his desk drawer, the top one on the right, hidden under a fake bottom. Thank you, Mr. Flagg. Do not you thank me. Just keep me out of a prison cell. Maggie walked out of the saloon and saw Jesse waiting for her across the way. He was leaned up against a hitching post, arms folded tight, his face a mask of concern. Well, he asked, Wednesday night we are getting that ledger. We? I need a lookout while I go inside. You are planning on breaking into Wade Prescott's house. I am recovering stolen goods. There is a big difference. The law might not see it that way. The law has not seen a thing Wade Prescott has done for 6 years. Sometimes justice needs a good shove. Jesse looked right at her. She looked right back. A cold wind kicked up between them, sharp with the scent of more snow. All right then, he said. Wednesday night it is. Wednesday rolled in under a cloudless sky, with a moon so bright it made the snow shine like polished silver. Jesse left the children with Rosa Delgado, who had come up from town to help with Ellie's mending, and had ended up staying on because Lucy asked her to, which was its own kind of small miracle. They rode over to the Prescott Ranch without a word. Jesse had his colt. Maggie had nothing but a leather bag and a backbone of steel. The house was pitch black. The stable was empty, except for 2 horses, which told them Wade and his foreman had gone on into town just like they planned. 10 minutes, Maggie whispered. If I am not out in 10 minutes, you ride without me. Like hell I will. Like hell I... Jesse, if something goes sideways, your kids need you. You gotta promise me. He did not give her a promise. Just a hard set to his jaw as he watched her move toward the back door of Wade Prescott's house. A little slip of a woman in a dark dress, moving like a determined shadow against the white snow. The door was not even locked. Folks in Silver Creek never locked their doors. It was a trusting habit, the kind a man like Wade Prescott had been using against them for years. Maggie slipped through the kitchen and down the hall. She found the office. She found the desk. Top right drawer, false bottom. There was the key. The safe was hidden behind a painting of all things. Maggie nearly laughed out loud. It was almost disappointing how predictable he was. She opened it with the key and saw the ledger right where Flagg had told her it would be. It was a black leather book with a gold clasp, feeling heavy with the weight of 7 years of sin. She was just reaching for it when she heard the front door creak open. Maggie went still. Footsteps were coming down the hall. They were heavy, sure of themselves, and they were not Jesse's. Jesse moved silent, like a mountain cat. This was the heavy tread of a man who figured he owned the very ground he stood on. I have been expecting you, Wade Prescott's voice boomed from the doorway. Maggie turned around slow. Wade stood there filling the entrance, his coat still on, his hat still sitting on his head. Behind him, 2 big fellas she'd never seen before were blocking her way out. They were large, they were armed, and they were looking at her like a pair of wolves that just cornered a rabbit. Orrin Flagg has been on my payroll for 6 years, little lady, Wade said with a smirk. Did you honestly believe he wouldn't sing the second you turned your back? Maggie's heart was beating like a drum against her ribs, but when she spoke, her voice came out even and cool. I figure you left your card game early. That tells me I have got you running scared. And scared men, well, they get sloppy. Wade smiled. It was about the coldest thing Maggie had ever witnessed. The only mistake that has been made here is yours. You should have just stayed back in Philadelphia, Mrs. Creed. That name hit her like a ton of bricks. He knew. He knew exactly who she was, where she came from, and what she was running from. Oh, yes, Wade said, seeing the look on her face. I know all about you. Emmett Creed happens to be a business associate of mine. He's been looking all over for you. Seems to me there is a matter of some outstanding warrants for you back east. Those warrants are based on forged papers, just like the ones you have been using against Jesse Holbrook. Prove it. Wade took a step into the room. You are standing here in my house without an invitation with your hand on my safe. In Montana, we call that breaking and entering. Around here, that is enough to get certain folks hanged. And just what kind of folks would that be? The kind with no family, no money, and not a single soul who would miss them if they were gone. A click came from the hallway, the sound of a gun hammer being pulled back, a sound you never mistake. And then came another click from the window behind Wade, a different gun, but a voice she knew. "That lady has got family," Jesse Holbrook said from the darkness just outside. "She has got me. And if any man in this room lays a hand on her, I will put a bullet clean through him before he can take his next breath." Wade Prescott turned around real slow toward the window. Jesse stood there in the moonlight, his Colt held steady and his eyes as cold as a blue norther. "You are fixin' to make a mistake, Holbrook. This would not be the first one. Maggie, you get that ledger and walk on out. I have you covered." Maggie snatched the black leather book from the safe, clutched it to her chest, and headed for the door. Wade's men fidgeted, looking to their boss for what to do. "Let her pass," Wade said. His voice was steady as a rock, but Maggie could see the rage simmering just beneath the surface. "This ain't over." "No," Maggie said, pausing in the doorway. She held up the book. "It is only just getting started." She stepped out into the night, into the chill, and straight into Jesse's arms. He caught her with one arm and kept the gun up with the other, and they backed away from the house together. They took one careful step after another until they made it to the horses. They rode like the wind through the moonlit snow, with the ledger safe in Maggie's satchel, and Jesse's Colt still in his hand. Neither of them said a word until they were a good 3 miles away from Prescott's land. "He knew," Maggie finally said. "He knew all about EMTT. He knew about the warrants." "We will handle it," Jesse said. "If EMTT has made it this far west, we will handle it, all of it. But the first thing we do is get that ledger into Dorothy's safe, and then we sit tight and wait for the marshal. And if the marshal does not get here in time," Jesse slid his gun back into its holster and looked right at her. In the moonlight, his face was a collection of sharp lines and deep shadows, and his eyes had a sureness in them that Maggie had never seen. "Then we will fight with what we have got, you and me together." Maggie held the ledger even tighter. Inside that book was a record of every crime Wade Prescott had ever committed, every family he had ruined, every single dollar he had stolen. It felt heavy in her hands, heavy with the weight of all those other people's pain. But it also felt light with the chance for justice. And as Maggie had come to learn, justice was always worth taking a chance on. Deputy Marshal James Colton rode into Silver Creek on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Maggie and Jesse had taken the ledger out of Wade Prescott's safe. He came in by himself on horseback, wearing a long coat that was dusted with snow from the trail and a badge that shined in the winter sun. He was a younger man than Maggie had figured, maybe 35, with keen eyes and the quiet nature of a man who does more listening than talking. Dorothy led him to the back room of her general store, where Maggie had every piece of proof she had collected laid out on the table. The ledger sat right in the middle, looking like the heart of something spoiled and dead that had finally been sliced open to be seen. "You put all this together?" Colton asked, as he flipped through Maggie's neatly organized files. "The cross-references, the figures, the timeline. I did it in 3 weeks. Numbers come together pretty quick when they are telling the truth. It is the lies that take a long time to build." Colton gave her a look that was somewhere between respect and plain disbelief. "Mrs. Calloway, I have been looking into Wade Prescott for 8 months. My office has a file on him 2 inches thick. And in 3 weeks, with just a box of receipts and a stolen book, you have built a better case than we have with all the resources of the territorial government. I had a good reason. Wade Prescott is trying to take my family's home." She said it without even thinking. My family. The words just hung there in the air, and Maggie could feel the truth of them settle deep in her bones. Jesse, who was standing by the door, heard them too. She did not look his way, but she could feel his gaze on her, as warm as a hand on her shoulder. "The ledger is what cracks this whole thing open," Maggie went on. "Every deal is written down in Wade's own handwriting. Every payment to Oran Flag, every bribe to the county men, every dollar he took from families he cheated, it is all in there. Names, dates, amounts, and the fake papers. Page 47. He kept copies of every last faked assessment, every false loan paper. He was particular about his crimes, Marshal. He wrote them down with the same care an honest man would use for his own business. Colton shut the ledger and leaned back in his chair. Here's the problem I see. You took this out of his house without his permission. A defense lawyer will argue we cannot use it in court. I took stolen goods from a man who is a thief. Every dollar written in that book was taken by cheating someone. That ledger is proof of a crime that is still going on, and I have got people who will testify. Martha Concade has a receipt that proves Wade took money for a debt she had already paid. Sarah Avery has papers that show her husband's tax bill was raised on purpose. Hector Ruiz can swear that Wade's men pushed him into selling his land for less than it was worth. I will need to have a talk with every one of them. They are ready. They have been ready for a long time. They just needed someone who would finally listen. Colton gave a slow nod. I will need 2 days to check the most important evidence and get the arrest warrants ready. Can you all keep this quiet until then? We can sure try, Jesse said from the doorway, but Wade knows we have the book. He is not just going to sit around and wait. Then do not give him a chance to make a move. Y'all stick together, stay out in public, and do not go anywhere by yourselves. I will send a wire to Helena for more deputies. This is going to get a whole lot louder before it gets quiet. Jesse drove Maggie back to the ranch, and they did not say a word. The children were with Rosa, who had moved into the house for a while after Ellie got sick and was showing no sign of heading home. Maggie was thankful to have her there. Rosa was dependable and kind and never got rattled, and she made tamales that even Lucy had to say were better than her own. They were about a mile from the ranch when Jesse pulled the wagon to a halt. "What is the matter?" Maggie asked. "Nothing is the matter. I just have something I need to say before we get back home. And the children are all over the place, and there is no peace and quiet left." Maggie waited. "You said my family back there at Dorothy's place. You called us your family, I know. Were you telling the truth?" Jesse Holbrook. I walked 12 miles in a blizzard just to get to this town. I've spent the last 3 weeks fighting a man who could squash me without even trying hard. I broke into his house, took his ledger, and stared down 2 men with guns. And I did every bit of it for a man and 3 children I have not even known for a full month. What do you reckon? Jesse just looked at her. The low winter sun was golden behind her, and the bruise on her cheek was finally gone. And her green eyes had a fire in them that was not about anger at all, but about the fierce, stubborn, and scary thing that was growing between them. "I reckon I would like to marry you," he said. "Not for the homestead, not for the children, though Lord knows they need you. Not for any sensible reason you can think of. I want to marry you because you are the most courageous person I have ever known. And because when you are in the same room, I feel like I can breathe again. And because I have not felt like that since Hannah, and I figured I never would again." Maggie's eyes started to sting. "You are asking me to marry you in a wagon, in the middle of a frozen road. I surely am. We have only known each other for 23 days. I know that. I am being investigated for things I did not even do. There is a man back in Philadelphia who wants me in jail, and another man right here in Silver Creek who wants to ruin me. I know all of that. And you still want to marry me? More than I have wanted anything in a long, long time." Maggie looked at this man, at his face weathered by the wind, at his calloused hands, and his storm-colored eyes that held more softness than he probably even knew. She thought about Virgil, who had courted her with bouquets and sweet talk, and then spent 6 years tearing her down piece by piece. She thought about EMTT, who had taken every last thing she had and had the nerve to call it justice. She thought about every man who had ever made her feel small, afraid, and like she was not worth a thing. Jesse Holbrook had never made her feel any of that. Not once. He had given her a job, a roof over her head, and the plain truth. He had trusted her with his children, his secrets, and his sorrow. He had stood outside Wade Prescott's window holding a gun and said, "The lady has got family." Yes, she said, but not until all of this is over. Not until Wade Prescott is behind bars and your ranch is safe and my name is cleared. I will not start our life together with a dark cloud hanging over us. That is fair, but when it is all done, Jesse Holbrook, I will marry you so fast it will make this whole town's head spin. Jesse smiled. It was the kind of smile that changes a man's whole face, that wipes away years of grief and hardship and leaves behind something that looked an awful lot like joy. He snapped the reins, and the wagon jolted ahead, and Maggie sat right there beside him, her heart pounding in her chest and her eyes wet, with a feeling she remembered from a long, long time ago. From before Virgil, from before it all went so wrong. It felt just like coming home. They got one single day of peace. One day with the children laughing and Rosa in the kitchen cooking, and Jesse mending the barn door while Maggie put the last of the evidence in order for Marshal Colton. One day of Ellie sitting right in Maggie's lap while she sewed, the little girl's small hands resting on top of hers, just watching the needle go through the cloth with a quiet wonder. One day of Lucy helping with supper without anyone having to ask, and Caleb reading out loud from his almanac, tripping over the long words but not wanting any help. Then Wade Prescott showed up. He rode up to the ranch right at noon the next day, and he had 6 men riding behind him. Jesse saw them coming from the barn and walked out onto the porch with his rifle in hand. Maggie came outside and stood right there beside him. Behind them, through the kitchen window, he could see Rosa getting the children together. "Holbrook!" Wade called out from his horse. He did not even bother to get down. He just sat there on that horse with the kind of easy arrogance of a man who truly believed he owned everything his eyes could see. "I have come to settle this thing like gentlemen. You brought 6 armed men with you to a family ranch. That is not how gentlemen do things. Let's just call it insurance. I am a careful man. Now, this is what is going to happen. You are going to give me back my property, the ledger, and then your little bookkeeper is going to get on the very next stagecoach heading east, back to Philadelphia, where some people are mighty eager to see her again. The ledger is proof of your crimes, and Maggie is not going anywhere. Then I will just take them both by force. I have the legal right to take back what is stolen, and I have a telegram from Emmett Creed that gives me the authority to detain his sister-in-law as a fugitive." "You do not have any legal right to anything," Maggie said, her voice clear and strong. "All you have is money and threats and men you hired with guns. That is not the law. That is just being a bully with a bigger purse." Wade's eyes narrowed. "You are a sharp one, Mrs. Creed. A little too sharp for your own good. Your husband was just the same way. He was real clever, right up until the moment his cleverness got him killed. My husband was killed with whiskey and foolishness. Do not you dare compare yourself to him, Mr. Prescott. You are not half as charming." One of Wade's cronies let out a laugh, but it died in his throat when Wade shot him a look that could have flash-froze a branding iron. "This is your last chance, Holbrook. Give me the ledger and the woman, or I will burn this ranch down to the dirt, just like I did to Tom Avery's barn and Martha Consincade's hayshed and every other thing that belonged to folks who got in my way." Jesse lifted his rifle. "Get off my property. You really think one fella with a rifle is going to stop me? He's not going to have to." That voice came from the road, right behind Wade's bunch. Marshal Colton came riding into view with 4 deputies on either side of him. They were all armed, and every last one of them wore the badge of the United States Marshal's Service. Trailing behind them on foot were Sheriff Pruitt and his deputy, along with Dorothy Perkins, Martha Consincade, and Hector Ruiz. And behind them, moving with the quiet grit of people who had been kicked around for far too long, came about a dozen folks from Silver Creek. Store owners, ranchers, working men and women, all people Wade Prescott had cheated, threatened, and brushed aside. They were not carrying any weapons, but they brought something a whole lot more dangerous. They brought the truth. "Wade Prescott," Colton called out, his voice ringing sharp and clear in the cold air. "I have warrants here for your arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, theft, intimidation, and conspiring to cheat citizens out of their legal property." I also have warrants for Orrin Flagg and 3 other men named right here in your personal ledger. You can come along peacefully, or you can make this a whole lot harder. It is your call." Wade glanced at the deputies. He glanced at the townspeople. He glanced at Jesse's rifle, and Maggie's unwavering gaze, and the faces of every single person he had robbed and ruined. They were all just staring right back at him with the cold comfort of justice that had taken its sweet time, but had finally shown up. "This is a joke," Wade spat. "My lawyers will have me out of here by dark." "Your lawyers are mentioned in the ledger, too," Maggie said calmly. "Page 63. They might be a little tied up with their own troubles." Something in Wade Prescott's expression just broke. It was not exactly fear, but more like the sudden, gut-wrenching realization that the world he had built, his whole crooked empire of lies and stolen land and shattered families, was crashing down all around him, and there was not a thing his money or his men or his connections could do to stop it. "Get down off your horse, Mr. Prescott," Colton said. "Do not make me ask you again." Wade swung down from the saddle. His men, seeing the deputies' guns and the crowd of angry faces behind them, made the smart choice to stay put. Colton snapped the cuffs on Wade's wrists behind his back, while the deputies took the guns from his men. "You will regret this," Wade snarled at Maggie as Colton led him away. "Every last one of you will regret this." "The only thing I regret," Maggie answered right back, "is that this day did not come sooner." She watched as they marched him down the road toward town. His fancy coat was dragging in the snow, and his hat tumbled off into the dirt, where nobody even bothered to bend down and get it. From behind her, she heard Lucy's voice at the doorway. "Is it over?" Maggie turned around. All 3 children were standing on the porch. Lucy had her arms wrapped around Ellie. Caleb was huddled close to his sister's side. And Ellie. Tiny, quiet Ellie was looking at Maggie with those big brown eyes that took in everything and gave away so little. "It is over," Maggie told her. Ellie took a step forward, then another one. She crossed the porch, walked right down the steps, and stopped just in front of Maggie. Then she lifted her arms up in that way a child does when they want to be held. Maggie scooped her up. Ellie wrapped her little arms tight around Maggie's neck and her legs around Maggie's waist and held on like she was never going to let go. "Stay," Ellie whispered. It was just that one word, but she said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Maggie buried her face in Ellie's hair and shut her eyes. She just held that child, that hurt but brave, unbreakable little girl, and she felt the very last wall around her own heart crumble to dust. "I am staying," she whispered back. "I promise you, I am staying." Jesse wrapped his arm around the both of them. Lucy came down the stairs and leaned into her father's side. Caleb found a spot to squeeze in, wherever he could, and Rosa stood in the doorway with tears on her face, watching this family put itself back together from all the broken pieces, just like Maggie's mother had taught her how to make something beautiful out of things that other folks had thrown out. They were married 3 weeks later in the little church at the edge of Silver Creek. Pastor Nathaniel Webb conducted the ceremony. Dorothy Perkins cried through the entire thing. Doc Shaw stood up with Jesse. He was sober for the occasion, with steady hands and clear eyes. Rosa held Ellie on her hip. Caleb was the ring bearer and only fumbled with the ring one time. Martha Consincade sat right in the front pew and cried for Henry, who should have been alive to see this day. And Lucy, who had fought so hard against this very moment, who had protected her sadness like a fortress and pushed back against Maggie with every bit of strength she had, stood right next to Maggie at the altar and held her hand. "Are you sure?" Lucy had asked that morning. She was standing in Maggie's room while Maggie got dressed in the cream-colored gown Dorothy had given her. "You really want to stay here with all of us? It is not easy, you know. Pa snores, Caleb breaks stuff. Ellie still does not talk a whole lot, and I am difficult." "You are not difficult, Lucy. You are strong. There is a world of difference." Mama was a fighter, but she passed on anyway. I know that, and I can't promise you I'll live forever either. What I can promise is that for every day I'm drawing breath, I will love you and your sister and your brother with my whole heart. And I give you my word I will never, ever choose to leave you. Is that enough for you? Lucy just looked at her for the longest time. This little girl who'd been a mother at 7 and didn't trust the world by 11. Then she stepped right up, wrapped her arms around Maggie and whispered, "It's enough." The trial got started that March. Wade Prescott, Orrin Flagg, and 4 other men were facing a total of 47 counts of fraud, forgery, and plain old theft. The proof Maggie had gathered up filled 3 whole crates. She took the stand for 2 days, and she walked that jury through every last number, every faked signature, every stolen dollar. She did it with the steady hand of a surgeon and the fire of a woman who knew firsthand what it felt like to have it all snatched away by a man who thought he was above the law. The lawyers for WDE tried their best to tear her down. They brought up those warrants from Philadelphia, all the ugly things EMTT Creed had accused her of. Maggie answered every last question with that same unshakable calm she brought to everything. Yes, my husband who passed was a criminal. No, I was not his partner in it. Yes, his brother pressed charges against me. No, there is not a lick of truth to those charges. And if this court wants to put EMTT Creed's so-called evidence against me next to the evidence I've brought against Wade Prescott, well, I'd welcome that. One of those cases is just a pile of lies from a grieving brother. The other is built on 7 years of documented stealing. The jury was out for only 4 hours. They found Wade Prescott guilty on 39 of the 47 counts. He got a sentence of 12 years in the territorial prison. Orrin Flagg got 5 years. The others got less time, and every last acre of land Wade had stolen was ordered back to the folks who owned it or to their children. Martha Concade got her ranch back. She just stood there in that courtroom when they read the verdict, clutching Henry's receipt in her hand, and the tears just rolled. Those warrants from Philadelphia were thrown out 6 weeks later. Marshal Colulton's office got in touch with the law back east and laid out the proof that EMTT Creed's claims were pure nonsense. EMTT himself ended up getting charged for filing false reports and for harassment. Maggie never heard another word from him. Spring finally rolled into Silver Creek the way it always did, taking its sweet time, like the land just hated to let go of the cold. The snow would melt in big patches, showing the brown grass and mud underneath, and then you'd see the first tough little green shoots pushing through. The cattle that made it through the winter, looking thin but still standing, were moved out to pasture. The birds started coming back. The creek ran high and fast with all the melted snow. Over at the Holbrook Ranch, Maggie put in a garden right next to the kitchen door. She started with herbs, the very same kinds her grandma used to grow, the ones that had saved little Ellie's life. After that came the vegetables, and then flowers, because Lucy asked for them. And Maggie would have lassoed the moon for Lucy if she could have. Jessie went to work rebuilding the stretch of fence that had buckled under all that snow. Caleb was his little helper, holding the nails and running to get tools, chattering on about anything and everything. Ellie trailed after Maggie all through the house like a tiny, quiet shadow. She wasn't always talking, but she was always there, always near. She had started to speak a little more, just a few words at a time, then a whole sentence. Every single one felt like a small miracle that Maggie took in with the gentle thanks of someone who knew that trust, once it's shattered, has to be rebuilt one single word at a time. On a warm April evening, long after the children were tucked in and the house was still, Maggie sat out on the porch with Jessie, just watching the sun dip below their land. Their land. That word still felt brand new, almost dangerous, like something that could be ripped away. "Your thoughts are making a racket," Jessie said. "I'm just thinking how delicate all this is. Everything we have, everything we've put together. One hard winter, one bad sickness, one man holding a grudge, and it could all just disappear. It could, but it's not gone. It's right here. Doesn't that scare you?" Scares the living daylights out of me every single day. But I'd rather be scared to death with you than feeling safe all by myself." Maggie leaned her head on his shoulder. He felt warm and solid and real. His arm wrapped around her was the surest thing she'd ever known. "I was just thinking on something Ellie said today," Maggie told him. "She's talking more and more now." "What did she say?" "She asked me if I was her mama now. And I told her that was her decision to make. And she thought on it for the longest time, you know how she gets. And then she said, 'You're my Maggie.' That's better." Jessie's arm pulled her in a little tighter. "She's right about that. That is better." They just sat there while the sky bled from gold to purple to that deep, dark blue of a Montana night. The first stars popped out, looking sharp and bright in the cold, clean air. Down at the barn, a horse nickered softly. Inside the house, one of the kids rustled in their sleep and then got still again. Maggie thought about the woman she was just 4 months ago, beat down and broken, stepping out of a stagecoach with 11 cents to her name and a dead man's reputation, with nowhere else on earth to run. That woman hadn't expected a single thing from this life but to keep breathing. She hadn't dared to even hope for a kind word, or a safe place, or love. She'd come to Montana hunting for a place to hide. And instead, she'd found a place to belong. She'd found a man who would stand out in the snow with a gun just to keep her safe. She'd found children who cracked her heart wide open and filled it up with something wilder and more gentle than anything she'd ever felt. She found a whole town of people that circled the wagons for their own and fought like hell against the men who tried to tear them down. She had found in the very last place she ever thought to look the one thing she'd been searching for her whole life. Not a husband, not a house, not even safety. A purpose. The deep down knowing that her mind and her grit and her pure mule-headed refusal to give up could actually make a difference. That she could protect the people she loved. That she wasn't the broken, worthless thing that Virgil Creed and his brother had always told her she was. She was Maggie Holbrook now, and she was right where the good Lord intended her to be. "Jessie," she said. "Hmm? Thank you for not being there to meet me at the stagecoach that day." He let out a low, warm laugh that rumbled from his chest right into hers. "You're thanking me for leaving you high and dry in a blizzard? I'm thanking you for letting me walk through it on my own. If you'd been standing there with a warm coat and a gentle word, I would have leaned on you from the get-go. But I wasn't. I had to learn to stand on my own 2 feet first. I had to prove it to myself that I could do it. And that made everything that came after feel like it meant so much more." Jessie kissed the crown of her head. "You would have been just fine no matter what. You're the toughest woman I know. I wasn't always, but I am now." The night closed in around them, cold and wide and just filled with stars. Inside the house, their children were sleeping sound. In the barn, the animals breathed and shifted in the dark. The land stretched out all around them, frozen solid and just waiting for spring to come and finish what it started. And there on the porch of a ranch that was almost stolen, in a town that was almost broken, 2 people who had almost given up on it all sat together in the quiet darkness. They held on to each other, and they held on to the life they had built from nothing but courage and numbers and a stubborn faith that it's never too late to start all over again. Maggie closed her eyes and just listened to the beat of Jessie's heart and the wind and the deep quiet of the snow. And she knew with a certainty that went clear down to her bones that this wasn't an ending. This was where it all began. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.